What if everything we know about the pyramids is a lie? Not just incomplete, not just missing pieces, but fundamentally wrong from the beginning? Because the pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the ancient chambers carved deep into bedrock, may have been standing for thousands of years before the first pharaoh was crowned, before Egyptian writing existed, before Egypt itself was even a memory. Look at the evidence we've ignored. The Sphinx bears scars of rainfall that hasn't touched this desert in 9,000 years. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants no 4th dynasty priest should have known: pi, phi, the exact radius of Earth. Inside its passages, no hieroglyphs, no mummies, no treasures, only silence, precision, and sealed doors leading to chambers we're not allowed to explore. Ancient Egyptian texts themselves admit these monuments were already ancient when their kings found them. So if Khufu didn't build the Great Pyramid, who did? And why has this possibility been buried as deeply as the chambers beneath the sand? Night falls over the Giza plateau, and the ancient stones begin to glow. The setting sun turns the limestone gold, painting long shadows across the sand. The Sphinx crouches at the edge of the escarpment, its gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, its body half buried, its face scarred by forces that should not exist here. Behind it, the 3 pyramids rise in perfect alignment, their angles sharp against the dimming sky, their presence so monumental that distance itself seems to collapse around them. The last tour buses pull away. Voices fade into the desert wind. And in the stillness that follows, something shifts. The monuments stop being tourist attractions and become what they have always been. Mysteries carved in stone, waiting in silence. For generations, we have been taught a clear story. The pyramids were built by the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty. Around 2580 BCE, Pharaoh Khufu commanded the construction of the Great Pyramid, a tomb to secure his passage into the afterlife. Tens of thousands of workers hauled 2.3 million limestone blocks up ramps, shaping them with copper chisels, assembling them with nothing but human will and royal ambition. His son, Khafre, raised the 2nd pyramid and carved the Sphinx in his own image. The 3rd pyramid followed under Menkaure. Together, they represent the pinnacle of Egyptian engineering, proof of what a unified kingdom could achieve. It is a story of triumph, stone and labor, kings and eternity. Textbooks repeat it, museums display it, and guides recite it daily to travelers who stand amazed beneath the towering monuments. But the desert remembers differently. As twilight settles and the wind moves softly through the ancient stones, doubts rise like shadows. What if this story isn't wrong, but incomplete? What if the Egyptians did not build these structures, but inherited them restoring what was already ancient, claiming what had been standing for thousands of years before their civilization even existed? This question is not born of fantasy. It emerges from anomalies that refuse to fit the official narrative, from evidence that whispers of a past far older, far stranger than anything history has prepared us for. Consider the Sphinx itself. Walk into the enclosure that surrounds it, and you will see walls carved deep into the limestone bedrock. The stone is not smooth. It is not wind-scarred. It bears deep, vertical grooves, the unmistakable signature of water erosion. Heavy, sustained rainfall, the kind that requires centuries to carve rock, the kind that has not fallen on this plateau in nearly 9,000 years. Long before the first Egyptian dynasty, long before writing, long before the Nile settled into its current course, rain fell here, and the Sphinx was already standing. Or consider the Great Pyramid. Inside, there are no hieroglyphs, no inscriptions, no mummies, no funerary goods, no ritual paintings or prayers for the dead. Only granite chambers, acoustically resonant passages, and a massive granite box without a lid. The structure encodes pi, phi, the Earth's polar radius, and the speed of light in stone. Its passages align with stars in ways requiring astronomical precision beyond anything attributed to 4th dynasty Egypt. It is not a tomb, it is something else entirely. And then there are the sealed doors. In 1993, a robotic camera discovered a limestone door with copper pins deep inside a narrow shaft. When engineers drilled through it, they found a second door behind it. Radar scans revealed voids beneath the Sphinx and pyramid. Exploration stopped. Access was restricted. The questions remain unanswered. Even the Egyptians themselves left clues. The inventory stela describes Khufu not as the pyramid's builder, but as its restorer. The dream stele shows Thutmose IV excavating the Sphinx from sand in forgotten times, as though it had been buried and reburied across ages. These are not the inscriptions of builders. They are the words of inheritors, of people who found monuments already ancient and tried to preserve them. If this is true, if the pyramids and the Sphinx predate dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, then everything changes. Human history is not a straight line from primitive hunter-gatherers to civilization. It is a cycle. Cultures rise, achieve greatness, and vanish. Knowledge is encoded, forgotten, and rediscovered. The pyramids would not mark the beginning of monumental architecture, but its survival relics from a lost age, preserved through catastrophe, waiting to be understood. The evidence does not live in a single place. It is scattered across disciplines that rarely speak to one another. Geology that reads, rain in stone. Archaeology that uncovers anomalies too precise to explain. Mythology that remembers ages before the flood. Genetics that reveals ghost populations erased from history. Mathematics that encodes Earth's dimensions in monuments supposedly built with copper tools. Piece by piece, these fragments assemble into a shadow narrative, one that asks us to look past the convenient story of kings and tombs and into a past far deeper than we have been taught. Tonight, we begin that journey. We will walk through stone and erosion, through ancient texts and sealed chambers, through mathematics and mythology. We will follow the evidence from Giza to Göbekli Tepe, from the Nile to the stars, from the surface of the plateau to the hidden voids beneath it. Each step will circle back to the same haunting question. What if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids? The sky darkens. The last light fades from the limestone. In this pause between day and night, the monuments seem to breathe, with the weight of time, not 4,500 years, but perhaps 10,000, perhaps more. The pyramids endure, indifferent to our stories, their stones watching as empires bloom and collapse into dust. And if we listen closely, we can hear the silence. Not as absence, but as presence. An invitation, a question, a memory preserved in geometry and stone. The Sphinx waits, the pyramids loom. Our investigation has only begun. If this investigation into forgotten history resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel to join us on future journeys into the mysteries that lie just beyond the edges of accepted knowledge. Dropping a like on the video will help others discover these hidden stories, and your thoughts in the comments become part of the ongoing search for truth. Also, let us know where you are and what time it is in your city right now. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let the evidence speak. Ahead lies the first piece of evidence, the one that cannot be explained away, the one written in water and stone, the geological proof that the Sphinx existed thousands of years before Egypt itself. The morning sun climbs over the plateau, and the Sphinx emerges from shadow. From a distance, it appears timeless, eternal, as though it has always occupied this edge of the desert. But distance conceals truth. To understand what the Sphinx reveals, you must descend into the enclosure that cradles it, the deep rectangular pit carved into the limestone bedrock, the walls that frame the monument, like the sides of an ancient quarry. Step down into that space, and the air grows cooler. The walls rise high on either side, blocking the wind. enclosing you in stone. Run your hand along the surface, and you feel something unexpected. Not the sharp edges of chiseled rock, not the smooth polish of crafted masonry, but deep, irregular grooves, vertical channels, rounded edges, undulating surfaces that ripple like frozen waves. This is not the work of human tools. This is the signature of water. In 1990, Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, stood in this same enclosure and saw what Egyptologists had overlooked for decades. Trained to read stone the way historians read scrolls, Schoch recognized the erosion patterns immediately. The limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged water, weathering deep vertical fissures carved by centuries of rainfall, the kind of erosion that occurs when water flows consistently over rock, cutting downward with patient, relentless force. But there was a problem. A profound, unsettling problem. The Giza Plateau has not experienced rainfall of that intensity for nearly 9,000 years. The climate record is clear. Around 10,000 BCE, as the last ice age ended, North Africa was green. Rivers flowed where sand now stretches to the horizon. Grasslands covered the Sahara. Hippos waded through lakes that no longer exist. Rain fell regularly, heavily, shaping the landscape over millennia. But around 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, the climate shifted, the monsoons retreated. The Sahara began its transformation into desert. By the time the Fourth Dynasty rose to power in 2580 BCE, the Giza Plateau was already arid, already dry, already the desert we recognize today. If the Sphinx enclosure shows evidence of water erosion requiring centuries of rainfall, then the monument must have been carved and exposed to the elements during that earlier, wetter climate. Thousands of years before Khafre. Thousands of years before Egypt itself existed as a unified kingdom. Schoch's findings were not based on speculation. They were rooted in geological comparison, the same methods used to date erosion patterns in canyons, riverbeds, and cliffs around the world. He examined the weathering on the Sphinx body and enclosure walls and compared it to the weathering on nearby structures whose construction dates are firmly established. The Old Kingdom temples, built during the Fourth Dynasty structures, definitively dated to the reign of Khafre and his successors, show completely different erosion patterns. Their limestone surfaces are weathered horizontally, worn smooth by wind and sand, the result of 4,500 years of desert exposure. The edges are sharp where protected, abraded where exposed. This is wind erosion, the slow grinding of airborne particles against stone, the expected wear pattern for monuments standing in an arid climate. But the Sphinx enclosure is different. Its walls show deep, vertical grooves, rounded channels, and wave-like undulations, the clear result of water flowing downward, pooling, and carving the rock over extended periods. Wind does not carve vertically. Sand does not create rounded fissures. Only water, persistent and heavy, can produce this type of erosion. The contrast is undeniable. Stand at the base of the Sphinx and look at the enclosure walls, then walk a few hundred meters to the Valley Temple with its precisely fitted limestone casing. The temple shows 4,500 years of wind damage. The Sphinx enclosure shows something far older. Schoch's analysis suggested that the Sphinx body and enclosure were carved sometime between 7,000 and 9,000 BCE, during the period when North Africa still received substantial rainfall. This would place the monument's origin in the pre-pottery Neolithic era, a time when human societies were only beginning to experiment with agriculture, when writing did not exist, when Egypt as a civilization was still millennia from its birth. The implications are staggering. If the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by 5, 6, or even 7,000 years, then the monument is not the work of Khafre or any pharaoh. It is a relic from a forgotten age, a survivor from a climate and culture entirely different from the one that later claimed it. The Egyptians would have encountered the Sphinx already standing, already ancient, already eroded by rains their own civilization never witnessed. This hypothesis faced immediate resistance. Egyptologists argued that no advanced culture capable of carving such a monument existed in North Africa during the pre-pottery Neolithic. Mainstream archaeology maintains that monumental stone sculpture and large-scale construction emerged only with the rise of complex societies, hierarchies, and centralized states, none of which, according to the accepted timeline, existed before 4000 BCE. But geology does not care about historical consensus. Rock records time with indifferent precision. The erosion patterns exist whether they fit our narratives or not, and there is another detail that deepens the mystery. The Sphinx itself is carved from the living bedrock, its body shaped by removing limestone around it, rather than assembling blocks. The same bedrock forms the enclosure walls. When the monument was created, those walls would have been fresh, sharp, and newly exposed. Over time, weathering would affect both the Sphinx body and the enclosure walls in similar ways, since they are part of the same geological formation exposed at the same moment. What Schoch observed was consistent weathering across both the Sphinx and the enclosure walls, evidence that they weathered together under the same conditions for the same duration. If the Sphinx had been carved in 2500 BCE, the enclosure walls should show 4,500 years of desert erosion, just like the nearby temples. Instead, they show far more extensive water weathering, indicating exposure during a much earlier, wetter climate. The only way to explain this discrepancy is to accept that the Sphinx is older, much older. Critics pointed to later repairs and modifications made by Egyptian dynasties, arguing that restoration work might confuse the weathering patterns. But Schoch's analysis accounted for this. The core limestone of the enclosure walls, beneath any later additions, shows the primary water erosion. The later Egyptian stonework, clearly distinguishable by its tighter joints and different weathering, sits on top of the older, rain-scarred bedrock, like a patch on ancient fabric. Imagine what this means. Picture the Sahara not as a desert, but as a savanna. Green grasslands stretching beneath seasonal rains, rivers carving paths through the landscape. And somewhere on a limestone plateau overlooking a fertile valley, someone carved a colossal figure from the bedrock, a lion, perhaps, or a creature we no longer remember, its face turned toward the rising sun. Centuries pass, the rains fall, the monument weathers, civilizations rise and fall in cycles we cannot trace. The climate shifts, the Sahara dries, the monument is buried, forgotten, rediscovered, buried again. By the time the Egyptians arrive, it is already ancient, its origins lost to time. They see it as a sacred remnant, excavate it, restore it, perhaps recarve the head into a pharaoh's likeness, and incorporate it into their own mythology. They did not build it, they inherited it. This is what the stone reveals. Not through hieroglyphs or inscriptions, but through the language of geology, a language that speaks in erosion patterns, climate records, and weathering signatures. The evidence is physical, measurable, and reproducible. The rain carved its testimony into the limestone long before any scribe learned to write. And if the Sphinx is indeed a survivor from a green Sahara civilization, then it stands as proof of something unsettling. Advanced human cultures may have existed far earlier than we have been taught. Not just villages or settlements, but societies capable of planning, carving, and creating monuments designed to endure. The desert keeps its secrets, but stone does not lie. The vertical grooves in the enclosure walls remain, silent witnesses to rains that fell when the Sahara was young, when the world was different, when someone stood on this plateau and carved a monument that would outlast their entire civilization. The Sphinx remembers what history forgot, and the rain impossible, ancient, undeniable remains written in the walls. Stone speaks in erosion patterns and weathering signatures. But the Egyptians left another kind of testimony, one carved deliberately into monuments, inscribed on stelae, preserved in texts meant to proclaim the deeds of kings. And when you read those inscriptions carefully, something unexpected emerges. The Egyptians themselves never claimed to have built the Sphinx. In fact, their own records suggest they believed these monuments were already ancient when they found them. This is not a modern theory. It is not speculation imposed onto silent stones. It comes directly from the inscriptions left by the pharaohs themselves, declarations carved in hieroglyphs, meant to be read for eternity, preserved on limestone tablets standing in the shadow of the very monuments they describe. The most revealing of these texts is the inventory stela, discovered in the 19th century near the Great Pyramid. Carved during the 26th dynasty, around 670 BCE, the stela recounts events attributed to the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh traditionally credited with building the Great Pyramid around 2580 BCE. But the inscription does not describe Khufu as a builder. It describes him as a restorer. The text is explicit. It states that Khufu discovered the Sphinx already standing, already ancient, buried to its shoulders in sand. According to the stela, Khufu cleared the sand away, restored the monument, and built a temple beside it to honor the gods. The inscription also mentions the pyramids as existing structures during Khufu's reign, not as projects commissioned by him. Read that again. According to this ancient Egyptian record, Khufu did not build the Great Pyramid. He found it. Egyptologists have long dismissed the inventory stela as a later fabrication, a piece of propagandistic revisionism created over 2,000 years after Khufu's death. They argue that the 26th dynasty, a period marked by attempts to revive Egypt's former glory, produced numerous texts that romanticized the past, attributing false histories to ancient kings in order to legitimize contemporary rulers. But dismissal is not explanation. If the stela is a fabrication, why would later Egyptians choose to diminish Khufu's legacy? Why portray him as a restorer instead of the architect of the greatest monument on earth? Propaganda typically inflates achievements, not reduces them. If the goal was to glorify the Fourth Dynasty, why not proclaim Khufu as the supreme builder, the visionary who commanded the Great Pyramid's construction? The stela does the opposite. It frames Khufu as someone who encountered monuments already standing, already in need of restoration. It suggests that even in his time, these structures were old enough to be buried, forgotten, and in need of excavation. And the inventory stela is not alone. Another inscription, far more famous and equally revealing, stands between the paws of the Sphinx itself. Known as the Dream Stele, it was erected by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1400 BCE, over 1,000 years after Khufu's reign. The stela recounts a story. As a young prince, Thutmose fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx during a hunting expedition. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, promising kingship if he would clear away the sand that had once again buried the monument up to its neck. Thutmose obeyed. He excavated the Sphinx, restored it, and later became pharaoh. The dream stele commemorates this act of restoration, and the inscription specifically describes the Sphinx as being in a state of ruin and neglect, buried by the sands of the desert over which it had stood since time immemorial. Note the language, since time immemorial, not since the reign of my ancestor Khafre, not built by the Fourth Dynasty. The text frames the Sphinx as something already ancient beyond memory, something that had stood so long it had been swallowed by the desert and forgotten. Why would Thutmose IV, a pharaoh ruling over 900 years after the supposed construction of the Sphinx, describe the monument as lost to time? If Khafre had carved it in 2500 BCE, then by 1400 BCE, it would have been roughly 1,100 years old, significant, but not ancient enough to be forgotten. The pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty were still remembered. The names of kings were still recited, temples were still in use. So why was the Sphinx already buried, already neglected, already treated as something older than the remembered past? The answer becomes clear when you step back and examine the broader pattern. Across multiple dynasties, across inscriptions separated by centuries, Egyptian texts consistently describe the Sphinx and the pyramids not as creations of Egypt, but as inheritances from an earlier age. They speak of restoration, excavation, and rediscovery, not of original construction. This pattern is significant. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything: wars, trade, temple construction, royal decrees, religious festivals. Pharaohs proclaimed their building projects with pride, listing every stone laid, every god honored, every enemy defeated. The walls of temples are covered with inscriptions celebrating the achievements of kings, often exaggerating their deeds to godlike proportions. And yet, when it comes to the greatest monuments at Giza, this boastful record-keeping falls silent. There are no contemporary 4th dynasty inscriptions inside the Great Pyramid describing its construction, no detailed accounts of how the stones were quarried, transported, or assembled, no hieroglyphs proclaiming Khufu's vision or engineering genius, just silence and later texts that speak of restoration rather than creation. Compare this to other Egyptian monuments. The Temple of Karnak has inscriptions detailing its expansion over centuries, listing kings who added columns, gateways, and sanctuaries. The mortuary temple of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel is covered with carvings proclaiming his victories and divine status. Even smaller tombs in the Valley of the Kings are filled with texts guiding the deceased through the afterlife, prayers carved into every surface. But the Great Pyramid? Empty of inscriptions. The Sphinx? No creation myth, no builder's signature, only later texts describing rediscovery. This absence is not an accident. It is a void where we expect to find certainty. And into that void, the later inscriptions whisper a troubling possibility. The Egyptians did not build these monuments because they were already there when Egypt rose to power. Consider the implications. If the Sphinx was already buried and forgotten by the time of Thutmose IV, then it must have been standing for far longer than the conventional timeline allows. Monuments don't become ancient beyond memory in just 1,000 years. Not in a culture that maintained continuous written records, not in a civilization that revered its ancestors and preserved their names. But if the Sphinx had been standing for 5,000 years, for 7,000 years, for 10,000 years, then the phrase time immemorial begins to make sense. Then the burial in sand, the lack of memory about its origins, the repeated need for excavation and restoration, all of it fits a different narrative, a narrative in which the Sphinx predates Egypt itself. The Egyptians encountered these monuments the way archaeologists encounter ruins today, as remnants of something older, something built by people whose names had been lost, whose purposes had faded into legend. They restored them, they venerated them, they built temples around them, but they did not build them. This is what their own inscriptions reveal, if we are willing to read them without the bias of the modern narrative. The inventory stealer and the dream stealer are not isolated anomalies. They are evidence of a consistent tradition, one in which the pyramids and Sphinx were understood as legacies from a vanished age, not creations of the 4th dynasty. Why, then, does mainstream Egyptology insist that Khufu built the Great Pyramid and Khafre carved the Sphinx? The answer lies partly in the absence of alternative evidence. Without contemporary inscriptions, Egyptologists rely on circumstantial connections. The proximity of the pyramids to 4th dynasty burial sites, the stylistic similarities between certain statues and the Sphinx's head, and the logistical feasibility of the construction timeline. But circumstantial evidence is not the same as proof. And when the Egyptians' own texts contradict the accepted timeline, we must ask, whose story are we trusting, and why? The sun sets again over Giza, and the Sphinx returns to shadow. The dream stele stands silent between its paws, its hieroglyphs still legible after 3,400 years. The words remain, time immemorial, not recent, not remembered, not claimed. Even the Egyptians, masters of stone and record, looked upon these monuments with awe and uncertainty. They saw themselves not as the architects of eternity, but as its custodians, not the creators of the Sphinx, but the ones who found it, buried and forgotten, waiting beneath the sand. The monuments were already ancient when Egypt was young. The inscriptions say it, the geology confirms it. And the silence inside the pyramids, untouched by the boastful hand of any pharaoh, echoes with the same truth. These are not tombs of kings, they are relics of something older, and the Egyptians knew it. If the Egyptians inherited the monuments rather than built them, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What were these structures originally designed to do? To answer that, we must leave the desert sun behind and descend into the interior of the Great Pyramid itself, into passages carved with impossible precision, into chambers that defy the logic of burial, into a silence that feels less like a tomb and more like a machine waiting to be understood. The entrance is narrow, steep, and suffocating. You descend through the original passage, hunched and careful, the limestone walls pressing close on either side. The air grows cooler, the sounds of the outside world fade. And then the passage opens, and you find yourself standing in the grand gallery, a corridor so vast, so architecturally sophisticated, that it stops you cold. The grand gallery rises nearly 30 feet high, its walls corbelled in overlapping limestone slabs that narrow toward the ceiling, creating a structure both functional and inexplicable. Each stone is cut with tolerances, measured in fractions of millimeters. The angles are perfect, the alignment is precise, and at the far end, the passage leads upward into the king's chamber, a room built entirely of red granite blocks, each weighing dozens of tons, fitted together so tightly that a blade cannot slip between them. Stand in that chamber. Let the silence settle around you, and ask yourself, does this feel like a tomb? There are no hieroglyphs on the walls, no prayers for the dead, no painted murals depicting the journey through the underworld, no inscriptions naming a pharaoh or invoking the protection of gods. Every other royal tomb in Egypt is saturated with ritual texts, images, spells carved into stone to guide the deceased through the dangers of the afterlife. The walls of tombs in the Valley of the Kings are covered floor to ceiling, with scenes from the Book of the Dead, protective deities, and declarations of divine kingship. But here, in the greatest monument ever constructed, there is nothing, just smooth granite walls, a flat ceiling, and in the center of the room, a massive rectangular box carved from a single block of red granite. This box, often called a sarcophagus, has become the centerpiece of the tomb theory. Egyptologists argue that it was meant to hold Khufu's body, that grave robbers emptied it in antiquity, and that the pyramid's funerary purpose is self-evident. But the box itself contradicts this interpretation. It has no lid. It never had one. The interior surfaces are rough, unpolished, unsuitable for holding a body wrapped in sacred linens. There are no inscriptions, no cartouches, no indication that it was ever used for burial. And here is the critical detail. The box is wider than the passages leading into the king's chamber. It could not have been brought in after the chamber was sealed. It must have been placed during construction, carved on site, or built into the structure from the beginning. This is not how tombs are designed. Sarcophagi are brought in during burial, not embedded as architectural features. The granite box in the king's chamber functions more like a component of the pyramid's design than a funerary object. And then there is the sound. In recent years, researchers studying the acoustic properties of the king's chamber discovered something extraordinary. The room resonates at a specific frequency, 110 hertzes. When sound is introduced, a voice, a drum, a tone, the granite walls amplify it, creating a harmonic resonance that vibrates through the stone, and into the body of anyone standing inside. This frequency is not random. Studies in neuroscience have shown that 110 Hz can alter brainwave activity, inducing states associated with meditation, trance, and heightened awareness. Was the chamber designed for this? Was it built to resonate, to amplify sound, to create an experience beyond the physical? If so, it was not a tomb. It was an instrument. The Grand Gallery, too, defies burial logic. Its corbelled walls create a space that amplifies sound, channeling acoustic waves upward and focusing them toward the king's chamber. Some researchers have proposed that the gallery once held wooden or metal resonators, devices that could vibrate at specific frequencies, turning the entire passage into a tuned acoustic chamber. The niches carved into the walls of the gallery, long assumed to be symbolic, may have been functional slots designed to hold components of a now vanished mechanism. Move deeper into the pyramid, and the anomalies multiply. Below the king's chamber lies the queen's chamber, another granite room with narrow shafts extending from its walls. These shafts do not lead outside. They were sealed from within, their purpose unknown. But when engineers measured their angles, they discovered something astonishing. The shafts align with specific stars, as they would have appeared in the night sky thousands of years ago. The southern shaft from the Queen's chamber points towards Sirius. The northern shaft aligns with the star Thuban, which served as the North Star during the era when the Sahara was still green. These are not random orientations. They are astronomically precise, calculated alignments that required knowledge of celestial mechanics, star positions, and the slow wobble of Earth's axis, known as precession. Why would a tomb contain star shafts? Why orient chambers toward constellations? The Egyptians associated certain stars with gods and the afterlife. But this level of precision goes beyond symbolism. These alignments suggest the pyramid was built by people who understood the heavens with scientific accuracy, who tracked the sky not for ritual alone, but for reasons we have yet to fully comprehend. And then there is the granite itself. The king's chamber is constructed from red Aswan granite, a stone rich in quartz crystal. Quartz is piezoelectric. It generates an electrical charge when subjected to pressure. The immense weight of the pyramid pressing down on the granite blocks would create continuous pressure, potentially generating weak electrical fields within the chamber. Combined with the acoustic resonance and star alignments, this raises a question. Archaeologists are reluctant to ask, was the Great Pyramid designed to harness energy? Not in the modern sense of power generation, perhaps, but in ways we do not yet understand. As a device for focusing sound, light, or electromagnetic fields, as a structure built according to principles of physics that align with natural forces, as a machine constructed for purposes that transcend burial. The mathematical evidence supports this interpretation. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid encode information far beyond what a tomb requires. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base is exactly 2 pi, meaning the pyramid's proportions encode pi, the mathematical constant that defines circles and spheres. The height of the pyramid, multiplied by 43,200, equals the polar radius of the Earth. The perimeter, multiplied by the same number, equals the Earth's equatorial circumference. This is not coincidence. The number 43,200 is significant in ancient astronomical systems, representing a fraction of the precession cycle, the 25,920-year wobble of Earth's axis. The builders encoded geodetic data, Earth's dimensions, into a structure supposedly built as a tomb for a single king. Why? The pyramid is also aligned to true north, with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree, more precise than most modern buildings. Achieving this requires advanced surveying, astronomical observation, and an understanding of Earth's rotation. The cardinal alignment is not symbolic, it is functional, as though the pyramid was designed to interact with the planet's geometry. Phi, the golden ratio, appears in the pyramid's slope angle. The dimensions of the king's chamber reflect harmonic mathematical relationships. The structure is saturated with encoded information constants, ratios, and measurements that suggest the builders possessed knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and Earth's physical properties. If this was a tomb, why encode such information? Why build with such precision? Why align with stars and cardinal points? Why construct acoustic chambers and quartz-filled granite rooms? The evidence points in one direction. The Great Pyramid was not built as a tomb. It was built as something else, a scientific instrument, a resonant structure, a geodetic marker, a repository of knowledge preserved in stone. Tombs are places of ritual and memory. They are decorated, inscribed, filled with objects meant to serve the dead in the afterlife. The Great Pyramid contains none of this. It is silent, mathematical, precise. It speaks not in words but in proportions, frequencies, and alignments. It feels less like a burial chamber and more like a blueprint, a structure designed to communicate information to whoever possesses the knowledge to read it. Walk out of the pyramid and into the desert sun, and the question follows you. If it was not a tomb, then what was it? What were the builders trying to achieve? What knowledge were they preserving? And why, after all this time, do we still refuse to see the pyramid for what it plainly is? Not a tomb, a machine, a monument to a science we have forgotten, a message encoded in stone, waiting for someone to understand. The silence inside the pyramid is not the silence of death. It is the silence of something waiting, something unfinished, something still resonating with purpose, even now, after millennia of neglect, and we have only begun to listen. If the Great Pyramid is not a tomb, and its chambers were designed for purposes we do not yet understand, then the next question becomes critical. What else lies hidden inside? For over a century, explorers assumed the pyramid's interior had been fully mapped 3 main chambers, a handful of passages, and nothing more. But in 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot into a shaft where no human could follow, and what it discovered changed everything. The shaft in question extends from the Queen's Chamber, one of the pyramid's central rooms. It is barely 8 inches square, far too narrow for any person to enter, too small even for a child. For decades, Egyptologists dismissed these shafts as symbolic, calling them air shafts or soul shafts, designed to allow the pharaoh's spirit to ascend to the stars. But if that were true, why were they sealed from within? Why build passages that lead nowhere? Gantenbrink designed a small robotic crawler equipped with a camera and lights. He called it Upuaut, after the Egyptian god who opens the way. On the 22nd of March 1993, the robot entered the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber and began its slow ascent. The camera transmitted grainy footage back to monitors outside the pyramid. Smooth limestone walls, tight angles, the shaft climbing steadily upward into darkness. And then, 65 meters into the passage, the robot stopped. Blocking the way was a limestone door. Not a collapsed section, not debris, a door, deliberately placed, carefully fitted, with 2 copper pins or handles protruding from its surface. The door was polished smooth, set flush into the shaft walls, clearly intentional. It was not designed to keep people out. No person could fit in the shaft in the first place. It was designed to seal something in. The discovery was immediately controversial. If the pyramid was simply a tomb, why would its builders construct narrow shafts leading to sealed doors deep inside the structure? What purpose could they serve? And more importantly, what lay beyond them? For nearly a decade, the door remained untouched. Requests to explore further were delayed, deferred, entangled in bureaucratic restrictions. Finally, in 2002, a team led by Dr. Zahi Hawass, then Egypt's chief archaeologist, received permission to drill a small hole through the door using a fiber optic camera. The event was televised live, broadcast to millions of viewers as though the pyramid's greatest secret was about to be revealed. The camera pushed through the hole, the lens adjusted, and on the other side of the first door, barely inches away, was a second door. Another limestone block, another barrier, sealing the shaft even deeper into the pyramid. The broadcast ended abruptly. The investigation was closed. No further exploration was authorized. The second door remains untouched. The shaft remains sealed, and the questions remain unanswered. Why build a door inside a passage no human can enter? Why place a second door immediately behind the first? If these shafts were symbolic, why seal them so deliberately? And why, when modern technology finally allowed exploration, did access suddenly become restricted? The pattern repeats across the pyramid. In the northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, explorers found a similar configuration. A narrow passage leading upward, a metal object embedded in the stone, and once again, restricted access, preventing further investigation. Radar scans conducted in the 1980 seconds and again in the 2000s revealed anomalies throughout the pyramid. Voids, chambers, cavities that do not appear on any architectural plan. Some scans showed hollow spaces beneath the king's chamber. Others detected large voids within the pyramid's core masonry, spaces that should not exist if the structure is simply a solid stack of limestone blocks. But each time these anomalies are detected, exploration halts. Access is denied. The data is classified or dismissed, and the official narrative remains unchanged. The pyramid is a tomb, fully explored, holding no further secrets. Descend beneath the Giza plateau itself, and the mystery deepens. In 1999, Hawass himself announced the discovery of a subterranean complex now known as the Osiris Shaft, located near the causeway connecting the pyramids to the Sphinx. The shaft descends over 90 feet through solid bedrock, passing through 3 levels of chambers before reaching a final room submerged in groundwater. At the lowest level, explorers found a massive granite sarcophagus surrounded by smaller chambers, all carved from the bedrock with precision that rivals the pyramid itself. The official explanation frames the Osiris shaft as a symbolic tomb, a cenotaph representing the mythological burial place of Osiris, god of the underworld. But the structure defies this interpretation. The shaft required advanced engineering to excavate, cutting through limestone and granite, managing groundwater, constructing chambers at depths that challenge even modern drilling techniques. The lowest chamber remains partially submerged, its full dimensions unknown, its purpose unexplained. And here is the troubling detail. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the shaft suggests it may be older than the 4th dynasty, much older. If true, this would mean the Osiris shaft, like the Sphinx, predates the rise of dynastic Egypt. It would mean there are structures beneath Giza that were built by the same unknown culture that left the rain-scarred Sphinx and the mathematically encoded pyramid. Radar and seismic surveys conducted around the Sphinx have revealed similar anomalies. Subsurface scans show voids, tunnels, and chambers beneath the monument spaces that do not correspond to any known excavation. In the early 1990 seconds, researchers using ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be a large rectangular chamber directly beneath the Sphinx's pores. The discovery generated international attention and calls for excavation. Permission was denied. The area was declared off-limits. And once again, exploration stopped precisely when it seemed most promising. Why? If these chambers are simply natural voids or empty tunnels, why not open them and confirm it? If they contain nothing of significance, why restrict access? The pattern suggests not absence of evidence, but suppression of it, a deliberate effort to control what is discovered and, more importantly, what is revealed to the public. Consider the logic. The Great Pyramid is the most studied monument in human history. It has been measured, scanned, explored, and analyzed for centuries. And yet, every time modern technology uncovers something unexpected, a sealed door, a hidden void, a subterranean chamber, access is restricted, and further investigation is halted. This is not the behavior of archaeologists confident in their understanding. It is the behavior of institutions protecting a narrative from evidence that contradicts it. The shafts inside the pyramid were not built for ventilation. They were not symbolic soul passages. They were constructed with purpose, sealed deliberately, and hidden for reasons the builders did not explain. The doors do not keep people out. They were never designed for people in the first place. They keep something in, or they preserve something behind them. Knowledge, perhaps. Objects. Evidence of the pyramid's true function. What lies beyond the second door? What exists in the voids detected by radar? What chambers remain sealed beneath the Sphinx, beneath the plateau, beneath the centuries of sand and silence? We do not know. And increasingly, it seems we are not meant to know. The pyramid was built with tolerance measured in millimeters. Its passages align with stars. Its dimensions encode the earth. Every detail suggests intentionality, planning, and purpose. So why would the builders create shafts leading to sealed doors? Why construct subterranean chambers at depths requiring advanced engineering? Why hide chambers beneath the Sphinx, seal them, and leave no record of their contents? The only answer that fits the evidence is the one mainstream archaeology refuses to consider. These structures were designed to preserve something. Not bodies, not treasures, something more valuable. Information, perhaps. Technology. Evidence of a culture that knew it was facing catastrophe and chose to encode its knowledge in stone, in mathematics, in hidden chambers that would survive the ages. The doors were meant to be found, but only by those capable of understanding what lies beyond them. The seals were not designed to keep grave robbers out. They were designed to protect what was inside from time itself. And we, standing on the threshold, equipped with robots and fiber-optic cameras, are finally capable of opening them. But every time we reach that threshold, access is denied. The door remains closed, the chamber stays sealed, and the questions multiply in the silence. What is behind the second door? What lies beneath the Sphinx? What knowledge did the builders hide in chambers we are not allowed to explore? The pyramid does not guard the dead. It guards secrets. And someone, somewhere, has decided those secrets must remain buried. The robot sits dormant, its camera dark. The shafts remain sealed. The voids beneath Giza stay unexplored. And the greatest mystery is no longer what the pyramid contains, but why we are being prevented from finding out. Sealed doors beneath stone are one kind of silence, but there is another kind, perhaps more disturbing. The silence of records that once existed and then vanished, erased by fire, flood, or deliberate destruction. If the builders of the pyramids left written testimony explaining their origins, where is it? And if such records once existed, what happened to them? The answer may lie in fragments, echoes of lost texts, references to manuscripts that no longer survive, stories preserved in the margins of history before they too disappeared. One such story concerns a Coptic manuscript allegedly discovered in the 19th century, a text that, if genuine, would overturn everything we believe about the pyramid's age. But the manuscript is gone now, destroyed under circumstances that remain unclear, leaving behind only descriptions, partial translations, and the haunting possibility that we once held proof of the pyramid's prehistoric origins and lost it. The story begins in the libraries of Old Cairo, where European collectors and scholars in the 1800s searched for ancient texts hidden in Coptic monasteries, private collections, and forgotten archives. During this period, Egypt was a treasure trove for antiquarians. Napoleon's expedition had sparked European fascination with Egyptian history, and manuscripts, papyri, and artifacts flowed out of the country into museums and private hands. Among these acquisitions were Coptic Christian texts, writings preserved by monks who had inherited libraries from earlier Egyptian traditions, some stretching back to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and in rare cases, even further. One such manuscript, reportedly discovered in a monastery outside Cairo, contained a passage that stunned the collector who first read it. The text, written in Coptic script but apparently translated from an older source, described the pyramids in terms that contradicted all known history. According to those who saw it, the manuscript stated that the pyramids were built before words, meaning before written language existed, and before the river knew its place, implying a time when the Nile had not yet settled into its current course. If accurate, this would place the pyramids' construction in a period predating not only dynastic Egypt, but the establishment of the Nile River system as we know it. Geological studies suggest the Nile underwent significant shifts around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. As the African climate transitioned from the wet conditions of the African humid period to the arid desert environment of today, a text claiming the pyramids existed before the river knew its place would be describing a structure built during or before this climatic shift, thousands of years before the Fourth Dynasty. Before writing, before recorded history, the collector who discovered the manuscript allegedly made notes and attempted a translation. He showed the text to colleagues, sparking debate about its authenticity and meaning. Some dismissed it as a medieval fabrication, a mystical or allegorical text not meant to be taken literally. Others were intrigued, seeing in the manuscript echoes of older Egyptian traditions that spoke of primordial ages before the gods themselves. But before the manuscript could be properly studied, photographed, or preserved, it was destroyed. The accounts vary. Some sources claim it was lost in a fire that consumed the collector's estate. Others suggest it was deliberately burned by parties unknown. A few references hint that the manuscript was sold to a private buyer and then disappeared, its current location unknown. What remains are second-hand descriptions, fragments of translations recorded in letters and journals, and the testimony of monks who claimed their monastery had once housed the text. Why would anyone destroy such a document? If the manuscript was a forgery, a piece of historical fiction created to mystify or deceive, why not expose it as such and preserve it as a curiosity? Forgeries are valuable in their own right. They reveal the beliefs and motives of their creators, the historical contexts in which they were made. Scholars study forgeries precisely because they tell us what people wanted to believe, what narratives they sought to construct. But this manuscript, if it was a forgery, behaved strangely. It did not glorify Egypt. It did not elevate the pharaohs or expand their achievements. Instead, it diminished them, suggesting that the pyramids, Egypt's greatest monuments, were not Egyptian at all, but relics from an earlier, unnamed culture. This is the opposite of what forgers typically do. When someone fabricates an ancient text, they usually aim to enhance a civilization's prestige, to invent legendary kings, to claim ancient wisdom or divine favor. They do not erase credit from their own culture and attribute it to an unknown predecessor. The content of the manuscript, as described by those who claim to have seen it, aligns disturbingly well with evidence that has only recently come to light. The phrase, "before the river knew its place," matches geological research, showing that the Nile's course changed dramatically during the transition from the African humid period to the current arid climate. The idea of construction before words aligns with the complete absence of inscriptions inside the Great Pyramid and the lack of any contemporary Fourth Dynasty texts describing its construction. And the manuscript's destruction fits a broader pattern of lost records surrounding the pyramids. Consider what has vanished over the millennia. The contents of the Library of Alexandria, which held texts from across the ancient world, including Egyptian records predating the Ptolemaic period. The archives of the Temple of Heliopolis, said to contain knowledge from Egypt's earliest dynasties, were dispersed or destroyed. Numerous papyri and inscriptions were lost to time, fire, conquest, and neglect. What remains is a fraction of what once existed. In this context, the lost Coptic manuscript is not an isolated anomaly. It is part of a pattern in which records that challenge the accepted timeline disappear, while texts that reinforce the conventional narrative are preserved and repeated. Whether by accident or design, the result is the same. Alternative histories are erased, and the story we are left with is the one that survived, not necessarily the one that was true. Coptic monks, as inheritors of Egyptian Christian traditions, often preserved knowledge that dated back to pre-Christian Egypt. They translated older texts, copied manuscripts, and maintained libraries that bridged the gap between the pharaonic past and the medieval present. If the manuscript existed, it likely was not a Coptic original, but a translation or summary of something older, perhaps a text from the Ptolemaic period, or even earlier, preserving oral traditions or written records that reached back into Egypt's prehistoric past. The monks who reportedly housed the manuscript claimed it was part of a collection inherited from an earlier monastery, one that had stood for centuries and accumulated texts from various sources. When European collectors arrived, seeking manuscripts to purchase or study, they were shown documents that included not only Christian writings, but older material myths, legends, historical accounts that did not fit neatly into biblical or classical frameworks. And then the manuscript was gone, lost to fire, they said, or sold and hidden, or taken by parties who preferred it, remain unseen. What did it truly say? We may never know. What remains are echoes, the phrases "before words" and "before the river knew its place," repeated in letters, journals, and second-hand accounts by scholars who heard of the text but never saw it themselves. These fragments are tantalizing, suggestive, but ultimately unverifiable. We cannot prove the manuscript existed. We cannot prove it was authentic. And we cannot recover what was written on pages that no longer exist. But the story endures, and it asks a question that resonates with everything we have uncovered so far. If there were records proving the pyramids were far older than we have been taught, what would happen to them? Would they be preserved, studied, and integrated into our understanding of history? Or would they be dismissed, suppressed, or destroyed deliberately or conveniently because they threaten a narrative that has been repeated for so long it has become indistinguishable from fact? The Great Pyramid stands silent, holding no inscriptions. The Sphinx is scarred by rains from an age before Egypt. Sealed doors remain unexplored, and a manuscript that might have explained it all was reduced to ash. Memory, it seems, is fragile. Stone endures where parchment burns. And perhaps that is why the builders chose to encode their message, not in words, but in geometry, in alignments, in dimensions that cannot be easily erased. Because they knew that words could be lost, scrolls could burn, but stone, if cut precisely enough, if placed deliberately enough, might survive even when memory itself is destroyed. The lost manuscript is gone, but the pyramids remain, and they still whisper what the text might have said. We are older than you know, older than history, older than words. The fire that consumed the manuscript may have silenced one voice, but the stones continue to speak. If the pyramids are relics of a forgotten age, if the Sphinx bears the scars of a vanished climate, if sealed chambers and lost manuscripts hint at knowledge deliberately hidden, then one question becomes inescapable. Was this phenomenon unique to Egypt, or does the pattern extend beyond the Nile, beyond North Africa, across the ancient world itself? The answer, when you begin to look, is as unsettling as it is undeniable. Giza is not alone. Across continents, scattered through landscapes, separated by oceans and millennia, stand monuments that defy the accepted timeline of human civilization. Structures so old they predate writing, so massive they challenge modern engineering. So precise, they suggest knowledge that should not have existed when hunter-gatherers still roamed the earth. These are not tombs. They are not isolated achievements of individual cultures rising independently. They form a pattern, a global signature of advanced construction appearing thousands of years before history claims it should, built by peoples whose names we do not know, whose purposes remain hidden, and whose very existence has been erased from the story we tell ourselves about the origins of civilization. The first and perhaps most revolutionary of these sites stands in southeastern Turkey, on a barren hillside overlooking the Mesopotamian plains. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and until its excavation began in the 1992, no one believed such a place could exist. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. To put that in perspective, it was already ancient when the first pyramids were supposedly built. It predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years. It predates pottery, metallurgy, and the wheel. It was constructed during the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period when human beings, according to every textbook, were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, with no centralized authority, no surplus labor, and no capacity for monumental architecture. And yet, there it stands. The site consists of massive stone circles, each anchored by T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, some weighing over 10 tons. The pillars are covered with intricate carvings, animals, abstract symbols, human figures rendered with skill that rivals much later artistic traditions. The stones were quarried from bedrock, transported uphill, and erected in precise arrangements. The circles were then deliberately buried, one layer atop another, as though the site was meant to be preserved rather than used. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe so disruptive. It was built before agriculture. The people who carved these pillars had not yet domesticated crops or animals. They had no cities, no kings, no written language. And yet, they organized labor on a scale requiring hundreds of workers, sustained over generations, coordinating quarrying, carving, and construction with an efficiency that suggests not only skill but social complexity far beyond what the timeline allows. If Göbekli Tepe can exist 12,000 years ago, then the assumption that advanced architecture requires settled civilizations, agricultural surplus, and hierarchical states collapses. Something else was happening in the deep past, something we do not yet understand. Travel west, across the Mediterranean, to the mountains of Lebanon, and you encounter another impossibility. At Baalbek, in the foundations of a Roman temple complex, lie 3 stones that defy explanation. They are called the trilithon, and they are the largest work stones ever used in construction anywhere on Earth. Each block weighs between 800 and 1,000 tons. They are precisely cut, fitted together without mortar, and positioned 20 feet above ground level in the temple's foundation. Modern cranes strain to lift 200-ton loads. The blocks at Baalbek are 5 times that weight, moved into place with tolerances measured in millimeters, set so tightly that centuries of earthquakes have not displaced them. The Romans built the temples above the trilithon, but they did not move the stones. Roman engineers left records of their projects, aqueducts, roads, colosseums, but they make no claim to the trilithon. They built on top of it, incorporating the massive foundation into their own work, suggesting they found the stones already in place, relics of an earlier construction whose origins even they did not know. And in the nearby quarry, still attached to bedrock, lies an even larger stone. It weighs an estimated 1,200 tons, partially carved, abandoned mid-extraction, as though the project was interrupted and never resumed. Who began cutting this stone? What technology were they using? And why did they stop? Cross the Atlantic, high into the Andes Mountains of Bolivia, and you find Pumapunku, a site that presents a different kind of impossibility. Here, the mystery is not size, but precision. The stones at Pumapunku are not the largest ever moved, but they are among the most precisely cut. The blocks are made of andesite and diorite, stones harder than granite, resistant to the copper and bronze tools attributed to the Tiwanaku culture that occupied the region. And yet, the stones are cut with machine-like accuracy, flat surfaces polished to near-perfect planes, right angles measured to fractions of a degree, interlocking joints that fit together like puzzle pieces, requiring no mortar, no filler, no adjustment. Some blocks contain channels and grooves carved at precise depths, as though rooted by machinery. Others show drill holes with uniform diameters, the kind produced by rotary tools operating at high speeds. But the Tiwanaku, according to archaeology, had no such tools. They had no iron, no steel, no advanced metallurgy. How, then, were these stones shaped? Skeptics suggest that the precision is overstated, that patient handwork with stone tools could achieve similar results. But when modern stonemasons attempt to replicate Pumapunku's cuts using Bronze Age technology, they cannot match the accuracy. The angles deviate, the surfaces remain uneven, the tolerances fail to meet the ancient standard. Something is missing from our understanding. Either the tools existed and were lost, or the techniques were far more advanced than we assume, or the timeline is wrong and these stones were cut by a culture possessing knowledge that has since vanished. Travel again, this time to the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. Beneath the surface lies the Hypogeum, a subterranean temple carved directly into the limestone bedrock over 5,000 years ago. The structure descends through 3 levels, encompassing chambers, alcoves, and passages hewn from solid rock with tools that, once again, should not have been capable of such work. But the true mystery of the Hypogeum is not its age or its construction. It is its acoustics. The oracle chamber, a small room deep within the complex, resonates at 110 Hz, the exact same frequency as the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. When sound is introduced at this frequency, the chamber amplifies it, creating a resonance so powerful that it vibrates through the stone and into the bodies of those standing inside. This is not accidental. The chamber was designed to resonate. The builders understood acoustic engineering, harmonic frequencies, and the interaction between sound and stone. They carved the space deliberately to produce this effect, shaping the walls, ceiling, and floor to create a resonant cavity tuned to a specific pitch. Why? For ritual, for healing, for altered states of consciousness? We do not know. But the parallel to the Great Pyramid is undeniable. Across thousands of miles and potentially thousands of years, 2 separate cultures built chambers tuned to the same frequency, using the same principle of resonant architecture. These sites, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Pumapunku, the Hypogeum, are not anomalies. They are data points in a pattern, a global pattern of advanced construction, precise engineering, and encoded knowledge, appearing long before the rise of the civilizations we credit with inventing such capabilities. The pattern extends further to the underwater structures off the coast of Japan, submerged since the end of the last ice age, to the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where stones weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together without mortar, to the stone spheres of Costa Rica, carved with geometric perfection for purposes unknown, to the dolmens of Korea, the standing stones of Karnak, the temples of Malta. Everywhere, the same signatures appear. Massive stones moved with impossible efficiency, precision cutting requiring advanced tools, astronomical alignments suggesting detailed celestial knowledge, and construction dating to periods far earlier than mainstream history allows. This is not the work of isolated geniuses or fortunate accidents. This is the fingerprint of a lost capability, a knowledge system that once existed across the ancient world and then vanished, leaving behind only the monuments themselves as proof that something greater once was. The implications are staggering. If Göbekli Tepe was built 12,000 years ago, if the Trilithon predates the Romans, If Pumapunku's precision cannot be replicated with Bronze Age tools, then human history is not the steady upward climb we imagine. It is something more complex, more cyclical, marked by rises and falls, knowledge gained and lost, civilizations that flourished and then disappeared, leaving only stones too massive to erase. The pyramids of Giza are part of this pattern. The Sphinx, with its rain erosion. The Great Pyramid, with its encoded mathematics and sealed chambers. The subterranean Osiris shaft. These are not isolated Egyptian achievements. They are fragments of a global phenomenon, a prehistoric culture, or network of cultures, possessing capabilities that challenge every assumption we hold about the development of human civilization. And if such a culture existed, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what happened to them? The stones remain. The builders are gone. But perhaps, buried in the smallest traces, genetic markers, mythological echoes, fragments of inherited memory, we can still find them. If a global culture once possessed the knowledge to build monuments like Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, and the pyramids, then where are they? Where are the cities, the pottery, the tools, the burials that should mark their presence? Where are the bones? For decades, this absence was used as the ultimate argument against any theory of a prehistoric advanced civilization. Show us the people, archaeologists would say. Show us the remains, the settlements, the physical evidence of the culture you claim existed. And for a long time, there was no answer. The stones stood as mute testimony, but the builders themselves seem to have vanished without a trace, leaving no skeletal proof of their existence. But in the last 20 years, a new science has emerged, one that can detect the presence of ancient peoples even when their bones have turned to dust. Their cities have been swallowed by time, and their artifacts have eroded into sand. This science is archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, and it has begun to reveal something extraordinary. Entire populations that once existed and then disappeared, leaving no archaeological record, no monuments, no memory, only the faint genetic signatures embedded in the DNA of peoples who came after them. They are called ghost populations. And their discovery is rewriting the story of human prehistory. The term ghost population refers to an ancestral group that contributed genetically to modern or ancient populations, but for whom we have no direct skeletal or archaeological evidence. They exist only as statistical anomalies in genetic data patterns of inheritance that cannot be explained by known historical populations, shadows in the DNA that point to ancestors we have never found. The first major ghost population was identified in 2016, when geneticists analyzing ancient and modern DNA from the Near East noticed something strange. The genetic makeup of early farmers in the region contained ancestry that did not match any known population. It was not from African groups, not from European hunter-gatherers, not from East Asian lineages. It was something else, something older, something that split from other human groups before any of the populations we currently know about. They named this lineage Basal Eurasians. These were people who separated from the main branch of humanity that left Africa, diverging so early that they carried none of the Neanderthal DNA present in nearly all other non-African populations. They existed, thrived, and contributed to the ancestry of later Near Eastern peoples. But we have never found their bones. We have never excavated their settlements. We do not know what they called themselves, where they lived, or what they built. But their genes persist, woven into the populations that came after them, silent proof that they were here. And Basal Eurasians are not alone. Similar ghost populations have been detected across the world. In Africa, genetic studies reveal the presence of at least 4 distinct extinct human lineages that contributed to modern populations but left no fossils. In Southeast Asia, DNA analysis has uncovered unknown archaic human groups that interbred with modern Homo sapiens and then vanished. In Europe, Ancient genomes show contributions from peoples who appear briefly in the genetic record and then disappear, replaced by migrations we can track, but whose ultimate origins remain obscure. Nowhere is this phenomenon more pronounced than in North Africa. Studies of ancient DNA from the region reveal a complex mosaic of ancestries, including contributions from populations that no longer exist. Before the Sahara became a desert, before the rise of Egypt, North Africa was inhabited by peoples whose genetic signatures do not match any modern or ancient group we have identified. They lived during the African humid period, when the Sahara was green, when lakes dotted the landscape, and when rivers flowed where now there is only sand. And then, around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, as the climate shifted and the desert expanded, these populations vanished. Some migrated south, merging with sub-Saharan groups. Others moved north and east, contributing to the ancestry of Mediterranean and Near Eastern peoples. But the core populations, the groups that lived in the Sahara itself during its green period, disappeared from the genetic record, leaving only faint traces in the DNA of their descendants. Who were they? What did they achieve? Did they build anything that has since been buried beneath the sands? We do not know. But the timeline is striking. The ghost populations of North Africa existed during precisely the period when, according to geological evidence, the Sphinx was carved and exposed to rainfall. They were present when the climate allowed for large-scale construction, when the Sahara was habitable, when a thriving culture could have developed in the region that would later become desert, and then they were gone. Erased by climate change, scattered by the desertification of their homeland, absorbed into other populations, or lost entirely. If such people built monuments during the Green Sahara, those structures would now lie beneath sand, their creators forgotten, their achievements attributed to later civilizations that encountered the ruins and claimed them. This is not speculation. This is the established pattern of human history. Climate shapes civilizations. Droughts drive migrations. Sea level rise drowns coastlines. And when the environment shifts drastically, entire cultures can vanish, their cities abandoned, their knowledge lost, their very existence forgotten within a few generations. Consider the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid and catastrophic climate change that occurred around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. In less than a century, global temperatures plummeted, glaciers advanced, ecosystems collapsed. Evidence suggests that this period was marked by widespread upheaval, megafauna extinctions, human population crashes, and the sudden abandonment of settlements across the northern hemisphere. Some researchers propose that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact, fragments of a comet striking the Earth, igniting wildfires, throwing debris into the atmosphere, and triggering rapid cooling. The hypothesis remains controversial, but the climatic effects are undeniable. Whatever caused it, the Younger Dryas was a bottleneck event, a moment when human survival hung in the balance and entire cultures may have been wiped out. If an advanced culture existed before the Younger Dryas, a culture that had developed monumental architecture, astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated engineering, what would have happened to them? Their coastal settlements would have been drowned by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Their inland cities would have been buried by climate-driven environmental changes. Their populations would have scattered, seeking refuge in regions less affected by the catastrophe. And, within a few centuries, their achievements would be forgotten, remembered only in myths of a lost golden age, a time before the flood, a civilization that vanished. This is the implication of the ghost populations. They are not just statistical artifacts in genetic data. They are evidence of real peoples, real cultures, real histories that have been erased by time and climate. And if those peoples possessed knowledge, if they built structures designed to survive catastrophe, then those structures might still exist attributed to later cultures, misunderstood, their true origins lost. The genetic evidence aligns disturbingly well with the archaeological anomalies. The ghost populations of North Africa existed during the African humid period, when the Sahara was green and the Sphinx shows evidence of water erosion. Basal Eurasians contributed to Near Eastern populations that later built sites like Göbekli Tepe and established the earliest agricultural societies. Ancient migrations track across the very regions where unexplained megalithic structures appear from North Africa through the Levant, Anatolia, and into Europe. The pattern suggests not isolated achievements, but a network of related cultures connected by shared knowledge, perhaps fleeing environmental collapse, carrying with them the remnants of a more advanced prehistoric society. As the climate shifted, as the Sahara dried, and the Younger Dryas devastated the northern hemisphere, these peoples moved, adapted, and in many cases vanished, leaving behind only their genes and, in a few places, their stones. Modern populations in North Africa, the Near East, and parts of Europe carry genetic markers from these ghost ancestors. The DNA persists even though the cultures themselves are gone, even though we have no names for them, no records of their languages, no certainty about what they built or believed. But the monuments remain. And now, with genetic evidence confirming that unknown populations once thrived in the exact regions and time periods where the anomalies appear, the possibility becomes harder to dismiss. The builders may not have left behind intact cities or extensive cemeteries, but they left something more permanent. Their genetic legacy, encoded in the descendants who survived them, and their engineering legacy, carved in stone, too massive to move, too precise to erode, too mathematically sophisticated to forget. The Sahara holds secrets beneath its sands. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have revealed ancient river systems, lake beds, and the outlines of settlements buried under dunes. These are not Egyptian. They predate Egypt by millennia. They belong to the ghost populations, the peoples who lived when the desert was green, who built during an age we have forgotten, and who vanished when the climate turned against them. If they carved the Sphinx, if they erected the megaliths at Nabta Playa, if they encoded astronomical knowledge into structures that later cultures attributed to themselves, then we are only now beginning to recover their story not from texts or artifacts, but from the genetic echoes they left behind. The ghosts are real. They existed. They thrived. And when catastrophe came, whether climate shift, cosmic impact, or something else, they disappeared, leaving behind only stones and shadows in our DNA. We are their descendants. And the monuments we thought we understood may be their messages, waiting for us to finally recognize them not as tombs or temples, but as testimony from a civilization that knew it was ending and chose to preserve what it could in the only language that transcends catastrophe: mathematics, astronomy, and stone. The desert remembers, the genes remember. And now, finally, we are learning to read what they have been telling us all along. We have followed the evidence through stone and erosion, through ancient texts and sealed chambers, through genetics and global megaliths. We have seen geological proof that the Sphinx predates Egypt, inscriptions admitting the Egyptians found monuments already ancient, mathematical encoding that defies the timeline, sealed doors leading nowhere, lost manuscripts destroyed before they could speak, global structures built before civilization supposedly began, and ghost populations vanishing from history, leaving only their DNA and their stones. The question that began this journey, what if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, has led us to a deeper realization. The pyramids were not built for the people who claimed them. They were not built for kings or gods or the glorification of any single culture. They were built for something far more profound. They were built as memory. Not memory in the sense of monuments commemorating past events, but memory in the most essential meaning of the word, the preservation of knowledge across the abyss of catastrophe, the encoding of information in a medium designed to outlast empires, languages, and even the civilizations that might try to understand it. The pyramids are time capsules, and the message they carry is not written in hieroglyphs or buried in scrolls. It is embedded in their geometry, their alignments, their dimensions, encoded in the universal language of mathematics, astronomy, and physics. A language that does not depend on culture, era, or even the survival of those who created it. Consider what the builders chose to preserve. They did not carve myths or legends into the walls. They did not leave inscriptions proclaiming their kings or recounting their victories. They encoded Earth itself. The pyramid's dimensions mirror the planet's geometry, its radius, its circumference, the mathematical constants that govern spheres and circles. The structure aligns to true north with precision that requires understanding Earth's rotation. The shafts point to stars whose positions shift over millennia due to precession, the slow wobble of the planet's axis. This is not decoration. This is data. The pyramid is a three-dimensional archive of geodetic, astronomical, and mathematical information, preserved in stone because stone endures where everything else, wood, papyrus, memory decays and disappears. Why would a culture choose to encode such knowledge? Why build a structure designed not for functional beauty, but for permanence and communication across time? There is only one answer. They knew what was coming. They knew that catastrophe was inevitable, that climate could shift, civilizations could fall, knowledge could be lost. They had perhaps seen it happen before, witnessed the collapse of earlier cultures, the forgetting of technologies, the reduction of advanced societies to scattered survivors struggling to rebuild from fragments. And they understood that writing, no matter how carefully preserved, is fragile. Scrolls burn, libraries collapse, languages evolve and become unreadable. Within a few centuries, texts become incomprehensible. Within a few millennia, even the script itself is forgotten. But mathematics is universal. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is the same today as it was 10,000 years ago, the same on every continent, in every language, for every culture that develops the concept. The alignment to true north does not change. The encoding of Earth's dimensions remains readable to any civilization advanced enough to measure and calculate. The pyramid is a message that does not rely on the survival of those who sent it. It speaks in proportions, in angles, in alignments, truths that transcend culture and language. And the message is clear. We were here. We knew things you may have forgotten. And we built this to remind you. This is why the pyramid contains no inscriptions, no funerary texts, no ritual objects. It was never meant to serve the dead. It was meant to serve the future. It was built not for the kings of Egypt, but for whoever would come after the catastrophe, whoever would eventually develop the tools and knowledge to measure, analyze, and understand what had been encoded in stone. Perhaps we are those people. Perhaps, after millennia of misunderstanding, after centuries of assuming the pyramid was a tomb because we could not imagine any other purpose, we are finally reaching the level of scientific and technological sophistication required to read the message the builders left behind. The sealed doors, the hidden chambers, the voids beneath the plateau, these are not defenses against grave robbers. They are puzzles, designed to be opened only by those capable of understanding what lies within. The mathematics encoded in the structure is a key, a test of whether the discoverer possesses the knowledge necessary to interpret what comes next. And if this is true, if the pyramid is memory preserved across the millennia, then the pattern extends beyond Giza. Göbekli Tepe, with its deliberate burial, becomes not a sacred site but an archive, sealed and protected for a future generation to uncover. Baalbek's impossible stones become foundations, built to survive earthquakes and erosion for tens of thousands of years. Pumapunku's precision becomes a demonstration of capability, proof that the builders possess technology and knowledge worth remembering. The global megaliths are not isolated achievements. They are nodes in a network, a prehistoric attempt to preserve knowledge in multiple locations, distributed across the world, so that even if one culture forgets, another might remember. Even if one continent is devastated, another might survive. Even if languages die and writing is lost, the stones will remain, carrying their message forward through time. This is the cycle. Civilizations rise, achieve greatness, and then fall, brought down by climate, catastrophe, war, or collapse. The knowledge they accumulated is lost, their cities crumble, their names are forgotten, and the survivors, reduced to scattered bands, must begin again from nothing, rebuilding slowly over millennia until they once more reach the threshold of advancement. But if the previous civilization was wise, if they understood the cycle, they would not let everything disappear. They would encode what they knew in the most permanent medium available, stone. They would build monuments designed not to glorify themselves, but to communicate with those who would come after, carrying forward the essential knowledge needed to rebuild, to remember, to avoid repeating the same collapse. The pyramids are that legacy. And we, standing now at our own threshold facing climate change, ecological collapse, the fragility of our interconnected systems should recognize them for what they are. Not relics of a primitive past, but warnings and wisdom from a sophisticated culture that understood impermanence, that knew greatness is temporary, and that chose to leave behind something that would endure. Night returns to Giza. The stars emerge, the same stars the shafts once pointed toward, the same sky the builders mapped with such precision. The Sphinx sits in shadow, its rain-carved body a testament to ages we have forgotten. The pyramid rises against the darkness, massive and silent, its stones holding secrets we are only beginning to uncover. And in that silence, if we listen carefully, we can hear what the builders are telling us across the span of millennia. We were like you. We built, we knew, we thrived. And then we fell. But we did not let everything die. We carved memory into stone, so that when you rose again, when you became capable of understanding, you would know you are not the first. Civilization has come before, and it will come again. Remember what we built. Learn from what we encoded. And when your time comes, when your own civilization faces its inevitable twilight, do as we did. Preserve what matters most, not in words that fade, but in stone that endures. Perhaps the pyramids were not built for the past. Perhaps they were built for the future, for the descendants of those who survived, for the cultures that would one day rise from the ashes of what came before. For us, the desert holds its breath, the pyramid waits, and somewhere in its sealed chambers, in its unexplored voids, in the mathematics encoded in its very dimensions, the message continues patient, permanent, and eternal. We are not the first to stand here in wonder, and we will not be the last. The cycle continues, memory endures, and the stones, as they have for thousands of years, keep watch over a history deeper and stranger than we have ever been taught. Sleep now. Beneath the stars the ancients knew. Dream of green Saharas and forgotten ages, and know that somewhere in the stones the truth waits carved in geometry, aligned with the heavens, preserved for the moment when we are finally ready to understand. The pyramids remember. They have always remembered. And now, perhaps, we can begin to remember too.